Somewhere in a museum right now, there's a skull that explains a monster. For almost 3,000 years, we assumed the ancient Greeks simply made everything up. The one-eyed giant, the creature that guarded gold at the edge of the world, cities of heroes that no one could ever find. We filed it all under imagination. Bedtime stories for a civilization that didn't know better. And then, people started digging. Here's the question nobody thinks to ask. What if the Greeks weren't inventing these things at all? What if they were doing their best to explain something they had actually seen with their own eyes and simply lacked the science to understand? So here is what we're going to uncover. The real object that almost certainly created the myth of the Cyclops. And it's sitting in plain sight. The mythical monster that guarded treasure, whose exact description turned out to match something buried in the ground for 75 million years. And the legendary city everyone was certain a poet invented, until one obsessed man dug it up and proved an entire civilization wrong. By the end of this, you're going to see Greek mythology completely differently, not as fantasy, as the oldest attempt at science we have. Let's start with the monster and the skull. The Cyclops, a giant with a single eye in the center of its forehead. It's one of the most famous monsters ever imagined, and for centuries the key word was exactly that, imagined, until a scientist looked at a skull. Here's the thing the ancient Greeks were dealing with that we forget. Their islands and coastlines were littered with the fossilized bones that no longer existed. Enormous bones, far too big for any creature they knew. And when you find the remains of a giant, your mind reaches for the only explanation it has. A race of giants must have lived here once. But one fossil in particular does something uncanny. Across the Mediterranean islands, there once lived dwarf elephants, a smaller prehistoric species whose skulls washed out of caves and hillsides for the ancient Greeks to find. And an elephant's skull has a feature that will stop you cold once you know it. In the center of the skull, right where a forehead would be, there is a single large opening. In life, that's the nasal cavity, the space where the trunk attaches. But elephants had gone extinct in that region long before. No Greek had ever seen one. So imagine finding a skull the size of a human torso, clearly some kind of giant, with what appears to be one massive eye socket in the middle of its face. You would not think elephant. You would think one-eyed giant. In 1914, an Austrian paleontologist named Othenio Abel proposed exactly this, that the dwarf elephant skulls of the Mediterranean were the likely origin of the Cyclops myth. The folklorist and historian Adrienne Mayer later built this out in detail in her research on how ancient peoples interpreted fossils. And once you see the skull next to the myth, the connection is almost impossible to unsee. So that's the first loop closed. The Cyclops probably wasn't invented. It was a reasonable, careful conclusion drawn from real physical evidence by people who had no concept of extinction or elephants. But that raises a bigger question. If one myth came from a fossil, how many others did? Because there's a second creature whose description is so weirdly specific that it points straight back into the ground. Here's the question. Why would anyone invent a monster that's a lion-sized creature with the body of a big cat, but the beaked head of a bird that lays eggs in nests on the ground and fiercely guards gold? That's the Griffin. And that last detail, the gold, is the thread that unravels the whole mystery. The Greeks were very specific about where griffins lived. Not in some vague, faraway land. They placed them in the deserts and mountains to the east, in the region around Scythia and Central Asia, in exactly the areas where nomadic peoples were mining gold. The griffin wasn't a random fantasy. It came attached to a location, a behavior, and a treasure. And here's what's actually out there in that ground. In the very regions the Greeks described, the deserts of Central Asia are full of fossilized skeletons of a dinosaur called Protoceratops. And a Protoceratops skeleton is extraordinary. It's roughly the size of a large dog or a lion. It walks on 4 legs and has a large bird-like beak on the front of its skull, along with a bony frill that, in a weathered fossil, can look like wings or ears sweeping back from the head. Now, picture ancient nomads and traders crossing those gold-bearing deserts and repeatedly finding these skeletons. A 4-legged, lion-sized creature with the beak of a giant bird, its bones lying near the gold they were digging for, sometimes near clusters of fossilized eggs. Adrienne Mayer is the researcher most associated with this idea, laying it out in her work on fossil origins of the Griffin legend. The description the Greeks gave, the size, the beak, the 4 legs, the nests, the association with gold, lines up with Protoceratops with a precision that's hard to write off as coincidence. So that's the second loop closed. The Griffin, guardian of gold, wasn't dreamed up out of nothing. It looks a great deal like ancient people accurately describing a dinosaur they kept finding in the exact place they said the creature lived. But fossils only explain the monsters. There's a whole other category of Greek myth, the stories of great cities and legendary wars, and everyone was certain those were pure poetry, until one man staked his entire life and fortune on the opposite bet. And that's the loop I promised you at the start. For centuries, the Trojan War was considered the ultimate myth, a beautiful epic poem by Homer about a 10-year war over a city called Troy. Scholars were nearly unanimous. Troy was a literary invention, a setting. It never existed. Homer made it up the way any poet makes up a world. Then came a man who refused to believe them. In the 1870s, a wealthy and relentlessly obsessive businessman named Heinrich Schliemann decided the experts were wrong. He believed Homer had been describing a real place, and he set out to find it, using the poem itself as a kind of map. The academic world largely regarded this as the fantasy of an amateur, and then he started digging at a mound in modern-day Turkey called Hisarlik. He didn't find nothing. He found a city. In fact, he found the layered remains of many cities built one on top of another across thousands of years, exactly at the location the ancient texts pointed to. A real, physical, fortified city had stood where everyone insisted there was only poetry. Now, Schliemann was a flawed and sometimes reckless excavator, and archaeologists have spent the decades since carefully sorting out what he got right from what he got wrong. But the core shock held. Troy was real. There was a genuine city there, one that had been destroyed and rebuilt, sitting in a strategically vital spot, matching the geography of the legend. And it wasn't the only one. Around 1900, the archaeologist Arthur Evans excavated a site on the island of Crete and uncovered an enormous, sprawling palace complex so intricate and maze-like in its layout that it immediately called to mind the most famous maze in all of mythology. The Labyrinth, the legendary home of the Minotaur, the story of a monster hidden in an inescapable maze, was attached to a real civilization that had built a palace complex genuinely resembling a labyrinth. That's the final loop. The legendary cities of Greek myth weren't all invented. Beneath some of the most famous fairy tales of the ancient world were real places, real civilizations, and real catastrophes remembered and dramatized long after the fact. So where does that leave us? Let's put it all together. The Cyclops was very likely a fossil elephant skull read by people who had never seen an elephant. The gold-guarding Griffin closely matches a dinosaur that litters the exact deserts where the Greeks placed the creature, and the legendary cities everyone dismissed as poetry turned out to real cases to be actual places buried under the ground, waiting to be found. Here's the part worth sitting with. We've spent most of history looking down on ancient myths as the opposite of knowledge. Superstition, fantasy, the things people believed before they learned to think properly. But that gets it exactly backwards. These myths were the ancient world's science. They were what brilliant, curious people produced when they encountered something real, a giant skull, a strange skeleton, the ruins of a fallen city, and did their absolute best to explain it with the tools they had. They observed real evidence, they reasoned from it. They passed their conclusions down through generations in the only durable format they had, story. They weren't being childish, they were being human, in the deepest sense, refusing to leave the mysterious unexplained. Which leaves one uncomfortable question. If so many myths we dismissed as impossible turned out to have something real underneath them, then what are we still calling fantasy today, simply because we haven't dug in the right place yet? The ancient Greeks weren't as wrong as we thought, and that should make you wonder how often we are.